On the 20th of January 2023, a federal judge sentenced Larry Ray to 60 years in prison for sex trafficking, racketeering, extortion, and a list of other crimes. But who is Larry Ray? And who were his victims? HULU have an exclusive documentary dropping this month, Stolen Youth: Inside the Cult at Sarah Lawrence, which brings first-hand interviews with conman Larry Ray's victims. The series follows the story from the cult's origins in 2010 on the Sarah Lawrence campus until its recent demise when the last members found their own paths to survival. The documentary premieres on February the 9th, exclusive to HULU. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and here is the director of the documentary Stolen Youth: Inside the Cult at Sarah Lawrence, Mr. Zach Heinzerling. So hello, Zach, and welcome to the show. Today's interview is going to be something slightly different, and I'm looking forward to learning all about yourself, your work, and the upcoming project that you've been working on. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. I'm Zach Heinzerling. I'm a filmmaker. I live in New York. I made a film called Cuting the Boxer in 2013. It was about two artists living in Brooklyn. I've done a few other documentaries, some about artists, some not, but mostly my work is finding people who I find interesting, that I have some personal connection to, and that I'm super empathetic to their experience and kind of living in their world for a period of time, and introducing what I find unique about them to a wider audience. And you could say the same of this story. This is a story about a group of students at Sarah Lawrence College who lived in a dorm together. And one of the students' dad, who had just gotten out of prison for a stock fraud charge, basically needed somewhere to crash, and his daughter thought it would be fine if she stayed with him a few nights, and that ended up becoming more than a few nights, and eventually he started relationships with a few of the daughter's roommates, sort of as a father figure, mentor, advisor, friend, but eventually it became manipulative and abusive, and he convinced them to move into his apartment in the Upper East Side, where these students were subjected to physical and psychological abuse for the better part of the next 10 years. And I was introduced to this project originally by the New York Magazine article, and then soon after by Dan Levin, who was one of the survivors, who reached out to see if I would make a documentary about this. And Dan is a poet. He's an artist. He really wanted to approach this subject matter from the point of view of the victims of Larry, and imbue it really with a sense of what it was like to be, when you're 19, impressionable, so that audiences would understand what happened, and not, as is typical, I think, with some cult stories, is we tend to blame the victim, or certainly think that it couldn't be us, or imagine that there's some formula for what makes someone susceptible to cults. And I think with this story, because of the diversity of the individuals, because of the intelligence of the individuals, we start to understand that this can happen to any number of people, and there are things to look out for, but it's really a hope to understand why and how this happens, so that other people um, can see themselves in the experiences of these victims, even though the extremities of the abuse seem so bizarre, and almost outside of reality, or what we would consider to be abuse, or why someone would ever want to exhibit this type of psychological abuse, because there seems to be no end, no rationale for the abuse. But we can kind of ground it and help people understand, and learn from it. So that's a little bit about the latest project, but I'm happy to dive into more specific questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have had the opportunity to see the documentary ahead of its release to the public, and everything you've said there about focusing on the individuals and coming at the subject from a kind of a sensitive perspective, but an educational standpoint as well. Absolutely, all of those points I thought were executed really well with this documentary. As you said,
Mm.
sometimes when there are reports or journalism or coverage of other things, it may not show the entire picture, but I feel like we really did get that kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And the end is really important as well in terms of deconstruction and healing, and how do individuals that have been subjected to this type of coercive control, how do they move on afterwards? And this is the first time I've really seen a lot of
Mm.
focus on that, which I thought was as important as telling the story of how the individuals got into the situation in the first place. So I was really
Yeah.
impressed. So I'm just having a bit of a fangirl moment. I thought it was brilliantly done. So in terms of being a director during a creative process, what is your preparation? What does your preparation look like? Is it the same for every project, or does it depend on the story itself? And with this, was there a difference because you were dealing with survivors of coercive control? Did you have to educate yourself on that to be able to execute the documentary in the way that you did? So, a million questions in one.
Yeah, I think it is. There are differences with each project, but I think you really have to have, you know, an initial interest and a personal connection with the people that you're working with. I really see each of these films as a relationship, with the subjects. I think a lot of some documentary filmmakers have, that they sort of appreciate the journalistic distance that would give someone a slightly more bird's eye or contextual view of the subject matter. And I think that's important, and certainly boundaries, um, when it comes to documentary filmmaking, are very important to establish, what you're doing, and make sure that you're not representing your relationship, because you develop a kind of friendship too, because people are telling you about their lives and you're listening, and that can be a very cathartic and emotional experience for someone. I would say with projects that I had done in the past, it was like a real fascination, both with what they did in their work, but also a fascination with just how they lived their lives, and some of the things that they might have been struggling with on a more kind of personal level. I think the kinds of films that I'm interested in, one, are really ones that sort of dig deep into, what these people are going through, in their personal life, in their relationships, in their family life. I think that when I watch movies, I often, learn so much about myself and my own experience, through relating to people and their insecurities and their vulnerabilities. And I think that's really powerful in both narrative and with fiction filmmaking. I think the same thing, can be true. So with Stolen Youth, it's different because you are working with survivors of coercive control, but also physical and sexual abuse. And so, yes, we did a lot of preparation before interviewing the survivors. I worked with Dr. Rachel Bernstein, who's a cult specialist, a therapist who, really just walked me through, how to approach the interview, how to make sure that you're sensitive in the process of because essentially you're asking them obviously about um, really, really difficult and potentially triggering subject matter. So, and with people that have been subjected to psychological abuse, a big thing for me was just listening. Spending the time to really listen and to not place judgment on these individuals, and to meet them where they were. And that ranged from Dan, who of course had been out of the cult for a number of years before I met him and was writing a book and had really had time to process what had happened, to Isabella and Felicia, who were, actively under Larry's influence, and meeting them where they were meant not judging them on the fact that a lot of the things that they were saying didn't make sense, and seemed to be obviously manipulations, due to Larry's influence. But I think a lot of what filmmaking can be, the best kind of, I think, documentary filmmaking is kind of it's almost you play a dual role. You're of course documenting this experience with the intention of showing it to a wider audience, so that they can learn from it, but also you're giving the subject room to speak, but also the camera kind of becomes a mirror, in a sense, where they can hear themselves talk and feel how how what they're saying makes them feel, and kind of see themselves through the experience of telling their story to someone else, and specifically someone else who's not judgmental and who is a fresh, unbiased person, right? I'm not their family member who they've had a past with that might make this conversation challenging for some way. I am essentially an ally who is listening to their story, and the way that they want to tell it, giving them a platform, and taking what they say at face value, and I think when this is more, I mean, it was really for a lot of the survivors, but I think that really they were timid in how they first spoke about it. But as they got more comfortable with me, and as they got more comfortable in how they spoke about it, it really strengthened their conviction in themselves. And that's a process that, of course, they're doing in therapy and in their own way. But these are people who were subjected to identity theft, whose complete conception of themselves was upended. And here they are explaining themselves to me and strengthening their sense of themselves as they're telling me the story. And that gives them comfort. That gives them a stronger sense of themselves, of who they know themselves to be. And so I think, I think that that's one of the sort of beautiful things that a documentary can do for, when you think of, subjects, it oftentimes feels like they're, actors in a movie, but it's very different in the documentary experience. And the people that you're interviewing really have to be invested in the process and feel like it's doing something for them. And I think in such a terrible story, I do think focusing on the survivors, um, and focusing on what the survivors wanted to talk about, which was how this happened to them and how Larry did this to them, as opposed to feeling the need to kind of, explain themselves or avoid, being talked about in the media, with salacious headlines as kind of, duped. How could this happen? And with a lot of distance and kind of big terms that nobody understands. I think this kind of brought it to their level and gave them a sense of a grounding and stability. Yeah.
I think that's
Sorry, that was a lot.
wonderful. It's amazing to hear that that's the experience that you had, and I'm sure that that reflects onto the individuals that were being interviewed for the documentary as well. I often find myself that the most moving parts of interviews are the parts that people haven't had a chance to prepare for. So I send ahead a list of questions, and sometimes I think people over prepare or script in their minds what they might respond. And if you ask a question that's not on the list, and somebody thinks about it and they kind of go with it and they explore the question, that's usually when people start remembering things that they hadn't thought about. And you can see the cogs turning and people are having these memories in front of you. And I think that's quite an incredible
Mhm.
experience. So I was going to ask if there was kind of an openness as the process progressed. And it sounds as if there was.
Yeah. I mean, the most interesting um, example of that is Felicia. And her process is probably the one that I'm personally most I find most compelling, her story in the project. Mostly because it was exactly that. She was really, figuring this out in real time in front of me. And she would take a question and take it in any number of directions. Some would be reliving an experience that she had, suppressed, that could be really, really traumatic. But seeing that in a different light, where Larry became the abuser as opposed to the victim, and so she was sort of, I mean, there's one example that's in the film where, she's telling me a story about, how her dad was absent when she walked out to show him this dress that she was really happy to show him, and he wasn't there. And then as she's telling me the story, she's realizing that actually this is Larry's, she calls it Larry brain, but Larry's way of telling the story was to say that her dad was absent, but she doesn't actually have a memory of her dad being absent. And that photo wasn't about her dad being there or not. It was just about her wearing the dress. But Larry had contorted this story to make it yet another story of how her parents were failing her, so that he could step in and be the hero. And I don't, I think when you're in constant trauma by a manipulative abuser like Larry, you don't have the freedom to understand these stories for yourself and to tell them to other people. You're just in a vacuum, in an echo chamber, of somebody's lies, and those lies become your reality. And I think what a terrible unspeakable thing that he put these individuals through. I still can't quite wrap my head around it. I look at these other stories, and there's so many kind of true crime stories out there, and all of them are terrible for different reasons, but maybe it's just because I was in the midst of this one, but it just feels so much more insidious because of their age, and because of um, you know how much pain and suffering you would go through every day, just thinking of yourself in the way that he made these kids think about themselves. So anyway, not to take a super dark turn, but I do
Well, it's a
think,
dark story, isn't it? And
yeah.
he's a dark individual. At the time when I watched the film itself, it was a week or two before Lawrence Ray was sentenced to 60 years. So have
Mhm.
you placed something towards the end of the film now that kind of lets the audience know that that was his fate? And hopefully, well, I don't know if hopefully is the right word to use. And it seems as though that will be where he remains for the rest of his
Yeah,
life.
yeah, we put a card at the end of the film that basically says, he, at the age of 63, was sentenced to 60 years, which, uh, basically constitutes a life sentence. And I was at uh, the sentencing, and it was really the best part about it was the survivors were able to stand up and directly talk to Larry, to tell him, what he had done. I mean, the crazy part, I mean, there's a lot of crazy parts, but because Larry is such a delusional, psychopathic, narcissist, he can't actually hear anything that isn't in his worldview. So, but it was important for them to be able to say these things because there's so much silence that has existed. And I think the documentary was one opportunity for them to speak.
Hmm.
But the sentencing was just another, just to set the record. And then, of course, for them, hearing the judge, who during the trial, this trial had been delayed years and years. The survivors have been, just dragged along through this legal process, that started in, in early 2020. And you can't, there's such an air of silence around this. You can't really talk about it, and you're not really, you're really siphoned off in these channels, and it's very hard to move on with your life. So I think, of course, the finality, the sense of closure with the sentencing, and also just hearing the judge, who had been kind of weighing all this information, the judge definitively saying, this was an act of cruelty, beyond, you know, uh, beyond the realms of what I've experienced in my, time as a judge. And I think it really, of course, just vindicated a lot of the emotions that, justified and helped the survivors, cope.
After being so immersed in the lives and the stories surrounding the entire group from Sarah Lawrence that moved in with this man into the Upper East Side, how did that feel for you being in the courtroom when his verdict was read out? Because I imagine that's quite significant for you as an individual after being privy to the real inside mechanisms that he'd put in place within this group.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was the sense of closure, um, a sense of closure as well. Because with documentaries, you know, there's such a, a beautiful art form for me, because of the relationships that you develop, both with the subjects, but also your team, and how really dedicated to a cause most of the people working on the project are. Um, but they can, they can end up taking um, an inordinate amount of time. I think any documentary filmmaker will tell you that, maybe 2 years is probably the average but it could extend beyond. And I think it's because when you're reporting or telling a story about something that's unfolding, the story keeps going. You don't want to miss what's going to happen next. It's happening in real time. And with a court case and with COVID and delays, it really extended the project in a way that we didn't really foresee. So I think that, the sentencing and giving a real sense of closure to, okay, now, you know, the survivors really feel like they can not be so tight-lipped, and really open up and really, start to develop the relationships with each other in a way that they couldn't during the trial. And they didn't want to speak to the press about the film before the sentencing. So, we actually, we delayed the release of the film to accommodate the survivors' wishes to really be able to talk in the press when it comes out, because I think in the same way that this film started as a collaboration with the survivors, we wanted to present it in that way too, and allow them to talk about this experience, and open up to the world at the same time that the documentary was coming out. So I think in a way, yeah, it did give a sense of closure on the project. And I think that's important when you get invested in these projects with a lot of people's lives. So I think, I don't know, I guess I just always assumed that Larry would be in jail for life. So the idea that it was 60, or I think 60 is appropriate because it sends a message. But I guess I just always thought that because of the trial, I mean, you have to imagine the trial was essentially 3 weeks of the prosecution's case, which was comprised of video evidence and audio evidence of him just continually abusing these individuals. And I think the defense's case was maybe for like a few hours. So it seems like, the writing was kind of on the wall, and I kind of assumed that for the sentencing too. So there wasn't a lot of like suspense to the trial. It wasn't like, are they going to? So I was never like, in a position to question whether he was going to be convicted or whether he was going to be sentenced to a long time. So that part maybe, was maybe less emotional.
Well, it's an incredible film. I think that it's going to be an educational resource that people who maybe have not thought about the subject of cults or coercive control will be able to look at and recognize that anybody can fall victim to a predator if they set their sights on vulnerable individuals. And I really appreciated how all of the headlines and the media were saying sex cult, but this documentary was like, yeah, there was sex involved, but it's so much more than that. And we have to look at the whole picture to understand how the sex element came to be in the first place. And that is done so well with this documentary. So that is something that I'm learning as I go through my own education, is that media often mislabel things, and this documentary is going to set that straight as well. So that's a kind of personal note from me, and what I took away, just appreciating that aspect of it. I just had one question to finish on before we wrap up, because I know you
Yeah.
have another call to go to. Um, do you have any plans for the future for similar documentaries? I know Hulu are going through a whole thing at the moment where they're focusing on the subject of questionable people in positions of power, which is
Yeah.
great to see. We had The Deep End recently. That was another example, though a very different style of documentary. So do you have any plans for the future similar to this? And where can people find Stolen Youth Inside the Cult at Sarah Lawrence?
Stolen Youth premieres on February 9th on Hulu. And I don't have I don't have plans for a new documentary yet. I'm kind of in I guess I'll call it an exploratory phase. This project, we were working on it until the very last minute. So I think what's nice about the streaming platform is you can kind of immediately get it to audiences. We were releasing all 3 episodes at once. The lengths of the episodes can kind of vary, and people understand the platform as a place that they can consistently kind of get things that they like to see. So I think I'm super happy that we were able to kind of work on it, finish it, and then release it pretty soon after we finished. But that also means that I'm sort of back to the drawing board on what I'm doing next. But honestly, appreciating the kind of time that I have now to reflect, and I really appreciate what you said, because that was always the intention, and I hope that audiences see that everyone's vulnerable when they're 18, and I think that it's so easy to go to the lowest common denominator of a college sex cult, but hopefully what you're learning here is one of Larry's greatest tactics was memory manipulation. And I think that that's something that I don't know that it's necessarily been covered in a way in cult stories, where someone can essentially rewrite memories from your childhood and kind of rewrite you, and tell you a narrative that's more effective and more believable than the one you're telling yourself. And I think for any person at that age, that's effective. So I really don't see them as particularly damaged or vulnerable individuals. They were all super bright and had promising lives ahead of them. And I think what you said about avoiding the sort of easiness of what we're seeing in a lot of, I wouldn't say easiness, but the salaciousness of what a lot of true crime brings to audiences, and trying to push a deeper understanding is hopefully what comes out of this project. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, I really do think that's going to be the case. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it's received and what
Yeah.
audiences think. Because hopefully if it's successful, which I really, really do think it will be, Hulu will be like, we need to just keep making these things and putting them out there and educating people. So thank you
Yeah.
so much to yourself, Zach. You're an incredible storyteller, very sensitive, and it was compelling at the same time. So it really does hit. It ticks all the boxes, and the most important thing for me as a viewer was that it was educational. We just are lucky that we get to tie it up with a nice little bow with the monster in the middle of the picture sitting in his jail cell. So thank you
Yeah.
so much to yourself, Zach, and to your team, and for taking the time
Yeah.
to chat with me today.
Great.
And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Casey.
Take care. I'll speak to you soon. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.